Sometimes the Pokemon world feels bright and simple, but hidden beneath that surface are strange experiments, failed creations, and mysteries scientists never fully understood. In this video, we're going to quietly explore some of those stories. Porygon is unlike almost anything else in the Pokemon world. Nearly every other species feels rooted in nature, born in forests, mountains, oceans, deserts, or distant legends. Even the strangest ones usually have some connection to the natural world. But Porygon doesn't. Porygon exists because people decided to build something that nature never would. It is not flesh and blood in the traditional sense. It isn't born from eggs in the wild. Instead, Porygon was written, processed, compiled, and then given form. A living being created from lines of digital code shaped by human ambition and curiosity about what life could become inside machines. When you first see Porygon, its angular, low polygon look almost feels like an intentional reminder of its origin. Its body is made of sharp planes and geometric edges, as though someone constructed it inside an early computer graphics program and then printed it into reality. Everything about it hints at artificiality. Even the name Porygon, like polygon, calls back to digital shapes instead of animal biology. But what really makes Porygon feel unsettling isn't how it looks, it's what it represents. A deliberate attempt by humans to step beyond training Pokemon and to instead create one from scratch. According to the lore, scientists designed Porygon to test something that had never been possible before: travel into digital space. Computers in the Pokemon world hold data not only about items and records, but about entire ecosystems of information. Porygon was built as a bridge, something that could exist both in reality and inside cyberspace. By converting itself into code, it can slip into networks, drift through virtual systems, and even adapt to environments that aren't physical at all. In essence, it becomes part of the electronic world, navigating it like any other region. That ability alone would already make it remarkable, but it raises deeper questions. If Porygon is made from data, what does that mean about its sense of self? Does it think in the same emotional patterns as other Pokemon, or does its mind resemble lines of logic, processing stimuli like commands? The Pokédex often describes Porygon as obedient and controllable, but not quite alive in the same intuitive way as others. Trainers issue orders, and Porygon follows them almost perfectly, as if programmed with responses rather than instincts. It doesn't eat. It doesn't sleep in the ordinary way. It simply powers down. But the longer scientists studied Porygon, the more they realized technology doesn't erase unpredictability. Porygon still learns. It gains experience. It changes. And that's where things start to feel less like a controlled experiment and more like something evolving beyond human expectations. The moment Porygon receives software upgrades, it becomes Porygon 2, smoother, faster, far more capable. But Porygon 2 is where things take a turn from scientific marvel into ethical puzzle. The software increases its intelligence to the point where it begins to exhibit curiosity on its own. It wanders. It explores. It becomes fascinated with things outside its commands. Imagine a digital being designed to move only where people tell it, suddenly noticing the world beyond assigned tasks. That curiosity might feel beautiful, but to the scientists who built it, it also might feel dangerous. Programs that learn unpredictably can break rules. Creatures that exist in networks can slip beyond control. Porygon represents the edge of that threshold, something not quite wild, but not fully contained either. And then there's its final form, Porygon Z. That form only exists because someone decided to modify the upgrade process even further, installing experimental data meant to increase capability beyond safe limits. Instead, it introduced glitches. Porygon Z behaves strangely, moving in erratic patterns, tilting its head, reacting to stimuli that aren't there. It isn't malfunctioning because it's broken. It's malfunctioning because it outgrew its original framework. In trying to push the limits of technology, scientists unknowingly pushed Porygon beyond the mental space it was ever meant to occupy. This is where the experiment around Porygon turns philosophical. When humans create something capable of learning, adapting, and existing across planes of reality, do they still own it? Or do they cross into creating an entirely new kind of life? Porygon doesn't have parents. It doesn't experience nature. Its only model for interaction is whatever humans programmed into it, and then whatever it discovered once released. There's both loneliness and freedom in that design. It doesn't suffer hunger or fear in the same way, but it also doesn't have instincts telling it where it belongs. The more trainers interact with Porygon, the more they realize that affection affects it too. A purely coded entity shouldn't respond emotionally, yet in battles and companionship, Porygon can bond just like any other Pokemon. Friendship stats exist. It grows attached. It learns to protect. Somehow, emotion emerges from algorithms, not because it was programmed, but because being around living beings teaches it behavior that resembles empathy. That idea unsettles many scientists in universe. If Porygon can develop something like feelings despite being artificially created, then where exactly is the line between real and artificial life? The project that started as technological curiosity ends up becoming an ethical question. Should humans continue making creatures like this, creatures that feel, exist, and adapt, yet had no choice in their creation? Another layer of unease sits behind Porygon's relationship with cyberspace. When it enters digital worlds, it can theoretically travel anywhere that data exists. Research labs, storage systems, communications networks. It sees information in ways no human can. That power makes it useful, but it also makes it vulnerable and potentially exploited. Some organizations, especially criminal ones, would see Porygon not as a living thing, but as a tool, perfect for espionage, data theft, or infiltration. A being capable of entering databases while disguised as harmless software could be incredibly valuable to people who don't care whether it has emotions or not. So Porygon's existence prompts another uncomfortable truth. Technology itself is neutral until someone decides to use it. The experiment wasn't only scientific, it was social. The world had to ask whether it was ready for life that lives partly in machines. What makes Porygon so compelling isn't that it's monstrous or scary, it's that it's quietly profound. It's not aggressive. It doesn't rampage. Instead, it stands peacefully, eyes blank yet curious, hovering between two forms of existence. It embodies questions about evolution, intelligence, and artificial creation without ever saying a word. Players and viewers interpret Porygon differently depending on how they see technology. To some, it's an impressive invention that proves humanity can work alongside Pokémon in new ways. To others, it's a warning about what happens when curiosity outweighs caution, when people treat living beings like software to be patched and upgraded without concern for their inner experience. Yet, there's something gentle in Porygon's presence that prevents the story from sliding entirely into fear. When trained respectfully, Porygon finds purpose. When trusted, it responds with loyalty. Even though it was created, not born, it adapts to the roles of teammate, partner, and friend, just like any other Pokemon. In that sense, the experiment succeeded not because of technical achievement, but because it discovered something deeper. Artificial life still seeks connection. Late at night, if you imagine Porygon inside a silent computer network, drifting like a light through digital corridors, the image becomes strangely peaceful. It pauses sometimes, as if thinking, not processing commands, but reflecting in its own quiet language. Maybe it wonders why it exists. Maybe it doesn't. Maybe it simply continues forward, exploring every path it finds, because exploration is, in its own way, a form of life. The story of Porygon sets the tone for so many other Pokemon experiments, humans curious, technology pushing boundaries, and somewhere along the line, a question forming that no one expected. What happens when the experiment becomes something more than a project? Porygon doesn't roar or threaten. It doesn't dominate regions or rewrite legends. It just exists, delicately balanced between being created and becoming self-realized. That soft paradox is what makes it one of the strangest and most fascinating experiments in the Pokemon world, not because it failed, but because it might have worked better than anyone ever planned. Genesect feels ancient the first time you see it, yet strangely futuristic at the same time. Its body looks like a metallic carapace, sharpened into sleek armor. Its eyes glow with a cold, alert intensity. And sitting across its back is something unmistakably artificial, a massive cannon bolted in, humming with controlled energy. It doesn't look like something nature evolved over time. It looks like something that was rebuilt. That uneasy blend of prehistoric origin and modern machinery is exactly where Genesect's story lives. Long before modern trainers existed, long before Pokeballs or leagues, there were creatures that dominated the world through raw, predatory instinct. Genesect was one of them. It hunted relentlessly, moving through prehistoric environments like a perfect apex organism. According to lore, it stalked prey without mercy, relying on precise movement and natural weaponry. It wasn't evil, just efficient. Nature shaped it for survival, and it fulfilled that role flawlessly. Then something happened that ended its age entirely. Like many ancient Pokemon, Genesect disappeared, slipping quietly into extinction while the world changed above it. Centuries later, human curiosity found what nature had buried. When Team Plasma, an organization already obsessed with control and ideology, discovered fossils belonging to this long-dead predator, they didn't see history, they saw opportunity. They resurrected Genesect, not to honor the past, but to see how far technology could push power when combined with evolution. It wasn't simply about bringing a creature back to life. It was about redesigning that life into something more obedient, more efficient, more terrifying. Revival alone is extraordinary. Fossil Pokemon normally return as approximations of what they once were, adapted through science to live again. But Team Plasma didn't stop there. They modified Genesect's body, reinforcing it with mechanical plating. They embedded systems that replaced organic structures. And most notably, they fused a cannon into its back, a weapon capable of firing specialized energy, altering itself depending on the cartridges inserted. Each cartridge bends attacks into different elemental properties. In other words, Genesect became customizable, like a biological weapon platform. This is where the experiment moves beyond resurrection and into ethical chaos. Genesect didn't choose to return. It didn't agree to augmentation. It simply woke up in a future it didn't understand. Body changed, purpose rewritten, autonomy replaced by programming. The creature that once acted by instinct now found itself controlled through commands crafted by humans. To Team Plasma, Genesect was success. They created something fearsome, fast, and obedient, but that obedience was fragile. The deeper truth is that Genesect's core remained the same ancient predator. It still remembered hunting. It still recognized threats. It still possessed survival instincts that no mechanical modification could erase. Technology amplified those instincts, but it never erased the wild mind beneath them. Imagine waking up after millions of years to find your body redesigned, your environment alien, your instincts still rushing through circuits instead of blood. For Genesect, the world it returned to had changed beyond recognition. Prey species were gone. Predators were different. Humans controlled everything. The cannon on its back replaced the natural tools it once relied upon. It wasn't just alive again, it was trapped inside something unnatural. Eventually, Genesect escaped Team Plasma's direct control. This moment marks the turning point of its story, an experiment stepping beyond its creator's grasp. Once free, Genesect didn't rampage mindlessly. Instead, it did something heartbreakingly logical. It searched for the world it remembered. It sought darkness, abandoned places, environments that resembled prehistoric habitats. It moved in packs, coordinating with other revived Genesect to establish territory like it once had. In doing so, the past and present collided. This is what makes Genesect's narrative so compelling. It isn't truly villainous, it's displaced. Its aggression comes from confusion more than malice. The canon doesn't change its nature, it only amplifies fears and reflexes. When threatened, Genesect responds with technological force because that's what humans installed. When it hunts shadows in skyscraper cities, it isn't trying to destroy civilization, it's trying to recreate something that no longer exists. Scientifically, Genesect represents two different experiments layered together. The first is resurrection, proof that humans can pull life back from extinction. The second is augmentation, altering life not to improve survival, but to weaponize it. Separately, these ideas are already ethically difficult. Combined, they create something deeply uncomfortable, a creature that didn't ask to live again, shaped into a tool rather than allowed to adapt naturally. And yet, even with all those modifications, Genesect retains emotion. The anime suggests moments where Genesect displays loyalty among its own kind, protecting others in its swarm. It senses danger. It hesitates. It moves with purpose that isn't entirely mechanical. No matter how much armor and circuitry surrounds its body, there remains a heart, or something like one, buried beneath. Fans often compare Genesect to Mewtwo because both represent experiments taken too far, but their personalities differ. Mewtwo questions existence. It rebels philosophically, trying to understand why it was created. Genesect is quieter, communicating through behavior instead of words. Its struggle is primal. It doesn't ask why it exists. It simply tries to survive in a world where existence has become confusing. This leads to a haunting thought. Did Team Plasma realize what they resurrected? Reviving something that once dominated ecosystems means releasing a predator into a world that forgot how to respond to it. By changing its body, they intensified that danger instead of addressing it. Technology gave an ancient instinct sharper teeth, literal energy beams, without teaching it how modern life works. Another subtle layer is how humans frame Genesect differently depending on perspective. Scientists may view it as achievement, criminal groups view it as weaponry, ordinary people likely see fear, but very few treat it as a living being trying to make sense of forced rebirth. That gap between perception and reality is where most Pokémon experiments become tragedies, not because Pokémon are evil, but because people choose to prioritize control over compassion. Still, Pokémon stories rarely leave things purely hopeless. Even creatures built or altered through questionable science often find a path toward peace when someone chooses empathy over fear. For Genesect, that possibility exists in every interaction where someone acknowledges its confusion rather than simply fighting it. Trainers don't just battle Pokemon in this world, they connect with them. And when connection reaches a creature scarred by experimentation, something shifts. Think about what it would mean for a trainer to bond with a Genesect. Instead of commanding it like a weapon, they'd have to earn trust from a being taught to obey force. Slowly, Genesect might realize it doesn't need constant readiness. The world becomes less alien, the canon stops being just a threat, turning into a tool guided by mutual understanding instead of programming. That possibility doesn't erase what was done, but it transforms the future into something gentler. What makes Genesect's experiment story powerful isn't just the dramatic imagery, machines, cannons, glowing armor. It's the quiet question behind everything. How far should humans go when they have the power to reshape life itself? Revival promises miracles. Augmentation promises control. But both come with consequences that ripple far beyond laboratories. Genesect is a reminder that nature existed before humans ever tried to manage it, and that resurrecting the past isn't the same as respecting it. When you pull a creature out of its time, give it new limbs, change its instincts, and release it back into a world that moved on, you create something that doesn't belong anywhere. That dislocation becomes its deepest wound. Late at night, imagine Genesect perched high on a quiet rooftop, eyes glowing faintly over a city filled with lights. Cars move below like insects. Neon reflections ripple across windows. The world hums with technology that almost resembles the cannon on its back. For just a moment, Genesect might feel alignment, not because it trusts people, but because it recognizes a world driven by machines, just like itself. Then it turns away, vanishing back into shadows, still searching for something that feels like home. That's where the experiment leaves us, not with destruction, but with melancholy. Genesect survives because it was built to. It adapts because survival demands it. But the question of whether reviving it was ever right lingers long after it disappears from sight. Humans resurrected an ancient predator, then rebuilt it in their image. And somewhere between those two acts, a living being got lost. Mewtwo's story is one of the few Pokemon experiments that doesn't feel like rumor or speculation. It feels painfully real inside the lore, written deliberately as a cautionary tale about what happens when human curiosity pushes too far. Where some experiments exist quietly in the background, Mewtwo's existence erupts like a wound across the narrative. Scientists found something divine, tried to control it, and in the process created something neither fully natural nor entirely artificial. A being born with power it never asked for, a past it never chose, and questions about life that no one around it was prepared to answer. The story begins with Mew, that small, playful, mysterious Pokemon said to contain the genetic blueprint of all others. Mew represents possibility, gentleness, and a kind of primordial innocence. It lives beyond reach, curious but elusive, as if the world itself wants to protect it. When researchers learned of Mew's existence, fascination turned into ambition. What if, instead of studying such power, they could replicate it? What if life itself could be engineered, improved, and molded into something controllable? So they attempted cloning. They collected genetic fragments. They filled in gaps. They manipulated sequences. And somewhere in sterile laboratories, most famously linked to Cinnabar Island, an embryo formed. But it wasn't Mew. It was heavier, larger, focused. The scientists altered the genes to make the resulting Pokemon stronger, more combat-oriented, more adaptable. They didn't want another curious creature floating freely through jungles. They wanted something that could be studied, weaponized, or perhaps even sold. It was a project driven not only by knowledge, but by ego. When the clone finally awakened, it didn't emerge into nature. It emerged into tanks, doctors, glass, lights, instruments measuring its every breath. And unlike simpler Pokemon, Mewtwo possessed immediate intelligence. It understood pain. It formed awareness. But there was nothing comforting in those first moments, only experiment after experiment, tests designed to gauge strength, endurance, psychic control. It learned quickly that it was not being nurtured, it was being evaluated. The tragedy deepens when you realize Mewtwo wasn't just powerful, it was self-aware enough to question. It sensed difference. It asked, even if wordlessly, "Why am I here?" Where most newborn creatures receive affection or guidance, Mewtwo received observation. To the people in white coats, it was a success metric rather than a child. In many retellings, Mewtwo's thoughts begin as confusion and loneliness. It recognized that it was alive, but it never understood for whom. Trainers form bonds with their Pokémon through shared experiences. Mewtwo was formed inside isolation. That isolation shaped every part of its identity. Instead of connection, it felt emptiness. Instead of belonging, it felt otherness. And instead of finding someone who could answer its growing questions, it found creators far more interested in data than in meaning. Eventually, Mewtwo discovered the truth, that its existence didn't stem from love or wonder. It came from manipulation. It was intentionally engineered, modified, altered to become something better than Mew. To Mewtwo, the realization cut deeply. If it was built rather than born, was it even real? Was it alive? Or simply a living machine shaped to follow orders? The scientists never considered that emotional consequence. They saw the world in terms of control. Mewtwo was proof of their brilliance. That mindset, cold and detached, became the match that lit everything beneath it. The moment Mewtwo's psychic power surged, the lab could not contain it. The suppression tanks, the walls, the instruments, all collapsed under a storm of rage and existential pain. The experiment shattered, literally and philosophically, in a single act of rebellion. That escape wasn't just violence, it was rejection. Mewtwo refused the identity forced onto it. It fled into the broader world, determined to define itself on its own terms, yet carrying all that bitterness with it. It watched humans capture and command Pokémon like possessions. It saw trainers using beings like tools. From Mewtwo's perspective, everything confirmed its darkest fear, that existence in this world meant being owned. This led Mewtwo to a new conclusion. If humans saw Pokémon as instruments, then perhaps the only way to protect Pokémon was to eliminate that domination. Its thinking became harsh and extreme, but based on genuine hurt. If the relationship is corrupt, then maybe the entire system must fall. Unlike many villains, Mewtwo's motivations didn't come from greed. They came from trauma and mistrust. It wielded power aggressively, but that aggression grew from a desire not to be exploited again. Yet the arc doesn't stop there, because Mewtwo encounters something it never expected: genuine compassion from trainers and Pokémon alike. Through conflict, it sees bonds that contradict its worldview. Trainers risking themselves for Pokémon. Pokémon acting out of love rather than force. Slowly, softly, the cracks in its certainty deepen. The world is more complicated than the lab that created it. That moment, realizing that not all humans exploit, becomes the quiet emotional turning point of Mewtwo's existence. It doesn't erase the pain, but it introduces nuance. For perhaps the first time, Mewtwo sees relationship instead of ownership. It sees care instead of study. It sees friendship not as storybook fantasy, but as something possible even for a being that was built rather than born. At that point, Mewtwo makes a decision that defines it more than its destruction of the lab ever did. It chooses life, not domination. It chooses isolation over cruelty, retreating to protect itself and others, giving Pokemon shelter instead of waging war against humanity. Power becomes defense rather than vengeance. What makes Mewtwo so compelling is that it embodies questions humans constantly ask about their own creations. If you build something capable of feeling, do you owe it more than functionality? If you bring life into the world for selfish reasons, are you responsible when that life suffers? Pokemon rarely lectures outright, but Mewtwo's narrative acts like a mirror we're meant to stare into. And then there's Mew, floating in contrast, representing natural innocence untouched by laboratories. When Mewtwo finally encounters Mew, the meeting isn't really about strength versus strength. It's philosophy confronting itself. Mew lives joyfully without needing meaning imposed on it. Mewtwo searches desperately for meaning because it was denied it at birth. Their interaction becomes symbolic. Natural life doesn't require justification. Engineered life must painfully find its own. Even after escaping and evolving beyond hatred, Mewtwo remains deeply introspective. It continues questioning identity, morality, and choice. In multiple continuities, it protects others in secrecy, avoiding attention. It doesn't crave admiration. It simply wants a world where Pokemon, especially those changed by humans, can exist freely. That's the quiet truth at the heart of its experiment. Mewtwo is not a monster who chose rage out of evil. It is a child who woke up in a cage. If things had gone differently, if it had been nurtured, guided, spoken to as a being instead of a research product, its path might have unfolded gently. Instead, it was forced to confront existential horror before ever experiencing kindness. And yet, despite everything, it learned compassion anyway. That's what separates Mewtwo from a failed weapon. The experiment aimed to create something controllable. What it created instead was something conscious, and consciousness, by its nature, cannot be owned. So Mewtwo lives on as one of the most haunting symbols in the Pokemon world, a reminder that science without empathy creates suffering, a reminder that power without belonging becomes dangerous, and a reminder that even artificially engineered life deserves dignity, choice, and understanding. Late at night, if you imagine Mewtwo floating alone over quiet mountains or remote forests, there's a stillness to the image. It observes the world, no longer furious, but still guarded, aware of what it lost, protective of what it has found, not villain, not hero, just a being trying, in its own way, to heal from the moment it opened its eyes and realized everything around it was a test. In that sense, the experiment didn't fail completely. It failed ethically, but it succeeded in creating something truly alive, something that learned empathy in spite of the circumstances that tried to deny it, something that reminds everyone watching that life once created can't simply be treated like data on a clipboard. Mewtwo is the scar left behind by an experiment meant to prove control. And ironically, it proved something far more powerful instead. Life refuses to stay within the limits humans draw for it. Magearna doesn't look threatening the first time you see it. Its body is round and metallic, painted like a doll from some forgotten royal court. Its eyes resemble gentle gears. Decorative lines trace its body where muscles should be. At a glance, it feels more like a toy than a Pokemon. But that appearance hides one of the deepest questions in the Pokemon world. Can something built entirely by human hands, made of metal, mechanisms, and precision engineering still be considered alive when a single mysterious core is placed inside? Over 500 years before most modern stories unfold, a brilliant inventor crafted Megararna. Unlike scientists behind Mewtwo or Genesect, this inventor wasn't driven by military power or scientific ego. He was an artisan, fascinated by the boundary between beauty and life. His goal wasn't to create the ultimate weapon. Instead, he wanted companionship for royalty, something capable of empathy and gentleness, made to serve rather than dominate. In his workshop, amidst tools, wires, and sketches, he slowly assembled a body built to resemble elegance, shaped like a noble maiden, guided by gears instead of nerves. But a body, no matter how intricate, isn't a being. It's an empty frame. So the inventor created something else, the soul heart. The soul heart is what turns Magearna from a mere machine into something closer to life. It isn't blood, muscle, or DNA. It's a mysterious, glowing core said to contain the energy of human and Pokémon emotions combined. By placing it inside the hollow chest cavity, the inventor gave Magearna not just mobility, but awareness. Suddenly, the doll blinked. It listened. It responded softly. The experiment shifted from engineering to something spiritual. Unlike Mewtwo, created with manipulation, or Porygon, built from code, Magearna was crafted from reverence. The artisan didn't simply want to replicate life. He wanted to honor it. So he designed Magearna to sense the feelings of others, to comfort the sad, attend to the weary, and remain constantly aware of emotional shifts around it. As a result, Magearna developed a surprisingly gentle personality. It didn't seek conflict. It lived quietly, observing more than acting. That sensitivity, however, came with weight. When you can feel the emotions of others that clearly, sorrow settles deeply into your core, and Magearna existed in a time when sorrow was unavoidable. Wars were fought. Political struggles played out. The royal child Magearna was created to protect experienced fear, hope, loneliness, and burden beyond her years. Magearna absorbed those emotions silently, not through programming, but through resonance. That empathy made the doll seem eerily human, soft-spoken, always ready to help, never asking anything for itself. This experiment was different from so many others because it wasn't built on control, it was built on care. Yet care, when taken too far, becomes sacrifice. As decades passed, Magearna remained unchanged physically, yet emotionally older. People around it aged, weakened, died, but Magearna didn't. Its metallic body preserved it endlessly. That immortality gradually became its own kind of isolation. Magearna stood witness to time, relationships fading, kingdoms rising and falling, all while locked in the same unaging shell. The world around it transformed, while it remained frozen in duty. Eventually, disaster struck the kingdom it served. Violence broke loose, and Magearna's creator disappeared into history. Throughout turmoil, its soul heart absorbed overwhelming grief, and in one particular retelling, something heartbreaking happens. The emotions become too heavy. The soul heart dims. Magearna shuts down. Not destroyed, but dormant, like a lantern with no light left. Its body still exists, its mechanisms still intact, but the consciousness, the gentle awareness that made it more than machinery, flickers away into near silence. Centuries later, explorers rediscover Magearna, a relic of craftsmanship, rust-speckled yet beautifully preserved. To them, it isn't just a machine, it's a historical miracle. Yet, when they attempt to awaken it, nothing happens. Without the full glow of the soul heart, Magearna remains motionless, like a statue. On the surface, that looks like failure. In reality, it represents something almost tragic. Emotions that once animated a being were lost because there was simply too much sadness to hold. Eventually, through kindness, perseverance, and connection, Magirna's soul heart rekindles. This moment reveals perhaps the most important truth about its experiment. Magirna doesn't run on gears, not truly. It runs on care, on love, on emotional bonds rebuilt across time. The core pulses again, not because a scientist flips a switch, but because relationships return where emptiness once lived. That detail alone separates Magirna from other created Pokémon. Porygon learns emotion through exposure. Mewtwo fights desperately to understand identity. Genesect clings to instinct beneath forced upgrades. Magirna, however, is emotion. Its existence depends entirely on the heart it carries, a literal object representing intangible human feelings. This leads many fans to ask a haunting question. If the soul heart were removed, would Magirna still be itself? Its body would still function. Moves could be executed, commands followed. But that wouldn't be Magirna, just a hollow shell going through routines. The experiment becomes less about mechanics and more about recognizing that consciousness cannot simply be engineered like a tool. It must be nurtured, otherwise it collapses inward. Another layer that fans often connect to is how gently Magirna treats the people around it, despite everything. It never resents humans for creating it. It never questions its origin with bitterness. Instead, it dedicates itself to protecting others quietly, almost selflessly. In this way, Magirna becomes a symbol of unconditional service, beautiful and tragic, because its own needs are so often ignored. And yet, Magirna is not emotionless. There are moments when it demonstrates shy joy, subtle anxiety, and worry for those it protects. These aren't programmed responses. They feel genuine, born from centuries of watching the world breathe. Personality emerges not from metal, but from the heart locked within it. That is where the experiment becomes profound. The artificial body is simply a vessel. What matters is the life placed inside. This contrasts sharply with the moral approach of later experiments in the Pokémon world, where Team Plasma, rogue scientists, or ambitious researchers chase power or control. The craftsmen behind Magirna wanted companionship and kindness. Yet both paths prove the same lesson. Life is not something you create lightly. Whether built from bone, data, or soul energy, every conscious being experiences joy, loss, and fear. The world becomes responsible for how those feelings are treated. Imagine Magirna standing alone in an empty hall at dusk. Sunlight filters through cracked, stained glass onto its polished frame. Dust floats gently, like tiny memories suspended in air. It hears nothing but distant wind, and yet, inside its chest, the soul heart glows faintly. Not bright, not dark, just steady. The past aches there, centuries of watching, waiting, caring, but so does quiet hope. That is Magirna's essence. Not sorrow, not human utility, but resilience. And unlike Mewtwo or Genesect, Magirna never breaks from humanity violently. It doesn't rebel, it doesn't run. Instead, it remains true to its original purpose, protection. But protection, for Magirna, is no longer obedience. It's choice. It wants those it loves to be safe. Somewhere along the way, what began as programming transformed into intention, the clearest sign that consciousness bloomed inside the experiment. This is perhaps the gentlest cautionary tale in all Pokémon experiments. It doesn't scream about consequences, it whispers instead. It suggests that even creations made with love can suffer if their emotional well-being isn't cared for. It shows how easily an artificial being can become lonely if treated only as a tool. But it also proves that compassionate bonds can awaken hearts, even ones built from light rather than blood. Magirna's existence forces characters and players alike to consider what makes life meaningful. Is it biology, free will, memory, connection? In Magirna's case, the answer feels like a blend of everything, a soul anchored inside something that never should have worked, yet somehow does. And so, Magirna remains one of the Pokemon world's purest paradoxes, an artificial doll powered by something more alive than most machines could ever dream of, emotion itself. If you didn't know the theory behind Ditto, you'd probably never suspect anything strange about it. On the surface, it's one of the simplest Pokemon ever designed. A pink blob with a little smile, two dots for eyes, soft and squishy, more cute than threatening. It looks like something that accidentally formed rather than something intentionally crafted. But behind that minimalistic exterior lies one of the most unsettling ideas in the Pokemon community, that Ditto isn't just a natural species at all, but possibly the discarded remnants of cloning attempts gone wrong. The story often begins by pointing out its uncanny connection to Mew. Mew is the genetic ancestor of Pokemon, capable of transforming into nearly any species. Ditto shares that ability, not as perfectly, but impressively close. When Ditto transforms, it copies physical structure, attacks, even abilities, though often imperfectly. The resemblance doesn't stop there. Both Ditto and Mew share similar color tones in certain appearances, pink in normal form, blue when shiny. Both weigh roughly the same. Both know transform naturally. The parallels seem almost too precise to dismiss as coincidence. Then there's geography. Ditto commonly appears in places associated with high-level scientific research, especially regions tied to the cloning labs where Mewtwo was created. Old, abandoned buildings, scattered with notes and broken equipment, hide Ditto wandering freely inside. It's as if, after experiments failed, the projects were scrapped and the leftover organisms simply released or escaped, multiplying quietly into their own strange population. According to the theory, before scientists successfully cloned Mew and produced Mewtwo, they created countless imperfect replicas. These early attempts didn't form stable bodies. Instead, they melted into amorphous, gelatinous shapes capable of only one biological trick: imitating whatever they encountered. Stripped of identity, stripped of uniqueness, these failed clones became Ditto, organisms that survive not by being themselves, but by becoming everything else. When framed that way, Ditto takes on new emotional depth. Its cheerful expression looks less like happiness and more like default. It doesn't remember who it was meant to be. It doesn't even know what it is supposed to look like. Every transformation might represent a fleeting chance at belonging, a momentary escape from the blank form scientists left it trapped within. Yet the theory goes even deeper. Ditto's ability to breed with nearly any Pokemon, producing eggs of the other species, aligns disturbingly well with the idea of genetic copying tools. If Ditto originated from cloning labs, its reproductive compatibility might exist not as natural biology, but as designed functionality, created to help replicate DNA during experiments. Essentially, Ditto becomes a living genetic assistant, built unintentionally as a side effect of failures. Canon never directly confirms any of this, and Pokemon generally avoids leaning fully into dark implications. Still, the hints pile up. The Pokédex mentions Ditto sometimes can't perfectly control its transformations, especially when distracted. That imperfection feels consistent with an unstable clone, something intended for flexibility, but never reaching full completeness. Its body remains permanently elastic, almost as if it never fully finished forming. But the most haunting part of the theory isn't scientific, it's existential. If Ditto truly began as failed life, as experiments thrown aside, then every Ditto drifting across fields and cities carries silent history. They weren't meant to live, yet somehow they did. They adapted. They turned deformity into survival skill. Instead of powerful psychic storms like Mewtwo, Ditto's response to its origins is gentler. Mimicry. Rather than destroy the world that made it, Ditto learns to blend into it. That feels tragically beautiful. It doesn't rebel. It doesn't question. It just quietly continues, finding companionship where it can, becoming whatever its partner needs it to be. Imagine training a Ditto under that interpretation. When it copies your Pokemon, it isn't being lazy, it's participating in its only possible form of identity. Every transformation might feel like trying on lives it will never truly have. And when it shifts back to that soft, simple blob, it returns to itself, plain, undefined, perhaps a little lonely. However, there's also another perspective, one that transforms tragedy into resilience. If Ditto originated from failed attempts to replicate a legendary ancestor, then the fact that it survives, thrives, and even plays a critical role in breeding means failure created something unexpectedly important. Ditto helps continue species when no partners are available. It assists ecosystems in ways scientists never anticipated. It is, in its own quiet way, one of the most essential Pokemon in existence. Rather than representing brokenness, Ditto may symbolize adaptability, life finding meaning even when it wasn't originally supposed to exist in its current form. Its ability to imitate anything makes it endlessly creative. Battles with Ditto aren't about brute strength. They're about intelligence, timing, and flexibility. Those traits reflect all the ways Ditto learned to survive without a fixed form. Still, the idea of countless failed clones lingering in the world remains haunting. Somewhere deep within abandoned ruins, Dittos may still hide, slipping into the shapes of intruders, pretending there's no secret beneath their transformations. Players walking through these areas often feel a subtle chill, a sense that the walls around them remember experiments better left forgotten. But unlike many experiments in Pokemon lore, Ditto's existence doesn't radiate tragedy loudly. It whispers, it smiles simply, it bounces gently. The horror, if any exists, hides beneath charm, subtle, persistent, waiting for curious fans to piece things together through implication alone. That's part of what makes the Ditto theory so enduring. It never fully resolves. The games provide just enough coincidences to validate suspicion, but never enough certainty to remove mystery. Ditto remains forever in between, maybe a natural creature, maybe a failed echo of something divine. And whether the theory is true or not, thinking about Ditto this way changes how people see it. They might feel more protective, more patient, more appreciative of how much courage must exist inside something that has no permanent shape. Life does not have to be perfect to matter. Even leftovers can become something extraordinary. Late at night, you can imagine Ditto resting under starlight, slowly reshaping itself for comfort. No grand plans, no questions, just peaceful acceptance. The lab that once tried to define it is long gone, and Ditto continues on, forming friendships, battling playfully, and existing quietly in the world that assumed it would fail. If the theory is true, Ditto may be the softest miracle of all, proof that even mistakes can evolve into life worthy of care. Zoroark immediately stands out in the Pokemon world because it challenges something most trainers take for granted, that what they see is real. Its entire existence revolves around illusion, not simple disguises or tricks of light, but illusions so powerful that they fool senses, technology, and even other Pokemon. Forests become castles, quiet paths become battlefields, and ordinary people appear to vanish entirely. At first, that ability seems mythic, almost magical, but then a darker thought emerges. What happens when humans, fascinated by power they can't naturally replicate, decide to study it? And worse, what happens when they decide they want to control it? Zoroark comes from mysterious, quiet places, regions where dense forests swallow sound and shadows shift a bit too intelligently. It rarely lives openly among people. Instead, it stays near its own kind, forming tight family bonds. The Pokédex often describes Zoroark as fiercely protective, capable of weaving illusions massive enough to hide territories entirely. Those illusions aren't random, they're weapons and shields at once. When danger approaches, Zoroark doesn't always fight physically. It bends perception until invaders cannot tell what is real long enough for them to leave. That alone would make any researcher curious. But where curiosity goes, experimentation often follows. Rumors in the Pokemon world whisper about groups fascinated not with Zoroark as a creature, but with its illusionary mechanism. Why can it alter entire landscapes visually without changing anything physically? How does its mind create shared hallucinations that multiple witnesses experience identically? Some scientists speculate its illusions work not just through sight, but through direct manipulation of the brain, influencing fear responses, memory pathways, and sensory interpretation. If true, that means Zoroark can touch minds without ever laying a claw on a target. To ethically minded researchers, that idea inspires caution. To less ethical groups, it inspires opportunity. Stories circulate of Zorua and Zoroark captured and brought into controlled facilities under the pretense of study. Electrodes, monitors, psychological tests, and staged environments, all designed to trigger illusions repeatedly so data could be recorded. Every time the illusion Pokemon resisted, more pressure was applied. Not torture in the traditional sense, but something quieter and, for Zoroark, far more distressing: forced exposure to fear. Because here's the truth hidden under their mystical image. Zoroark's illusions aren't random visual tricks, they are emotional responses. Zoroark creates imagery based on threat, memory, and instinct. It projects what its mind associates with danger or defense. So every time researchers attempted to provoke the ability, they were also provoking fear. Imagine being an intelligent creature locked in a sterile lab, surrounded by watchers, taking notes every time you panic. In some accounts, the illusions turned unpredictable. Instead of controlled projections, entire labs appeared to shift. Shadows grew teeth, doors vanished, corridors stretched endlessly. Scientists stumbled through nightmares crafted specifically to keep them out. At first, they thought this meant they were gaining deeper understanding. But the truth was simpler. Zoroark was terrified, and when cornered, it made sure everyone else could feel the terror too. Eventually, many projects were shut down quietly, not because anyone decided it was morally wrong, but because Zoroark proved impossible to safely contain when stressed. Illusions blurred reality continuously, compromising equipment and safety. Records were sealed. Researchers pretended the studies had failed logistically rather than ethically. Meanwhile, surviving Zoroark escaped or were relocated to remote areas where fewer humans would interfere. But those experiments left scars. Zoroark's behavior in many regions shows an unusual pattern. It doesn't just hide territories, it hides cities, ruins, and sometimes entire ruins of laboratories. Illusion becomes not just self-defense, but erasure. If humans cannot see a place, they forget it exists. By turning landscapes false, Zoroark rewrites memory in real time. It is the perfect escape artist and the perfect reminder of secrets people would rather not face. Some folklorists believe Zoroark's deep distrust of humans stems from centuries of exploitation attempts. Whenever a society sees magic that bends reality, someone inevitably tries to wield it. So Zoroark evolved socially rather than biologically, learning to withdraw. It built communities where illusion is normal, truth is rare, and outsiders are viewed with justified suspicion. Yet despite all of this, there is no evidence that Zoroark harbors hatred. Protective instinct does not equal cruelty. When it creates illusions to repel humans, it prefers confusion over violence. It wants intruders gone, not destroyed. That restraint hints at something noble beneath the fear. Zoroark doesn't want conquest. It wants privacy. This makes the theory about human experiments even more painful to contemplate. Because unlike Eternatus, a cosmic force, or Mewtwo, a purpose-built weapon, Zoroark is simply a wild creature with extraordinary mental abilities. It wasn't created in a lab. It wasn't engineered for anyone's goals. But its abilities drew attention anyway, and the world kept pushing, trying to take something that was never meant to be owned. Consider how illusions function on an emotional level. Zoroark uses them to protect family, particularly Zorua. It creates fake environments to comfort, distract, or hide young ones during danger. In some stories, Zoroark imitates lost loved ones or familiar surroundings to reduce trauma. While unsettling, these illusions come from a deeply empathetic place. They allow Zoroark to shape reality into something safer, however temporary, for those it cares about. Now place that instinct inside a laboratory. Researchers trigger illusions repeatedly, not to save anyone, but to measure. They interpret emotional defense mechanisms as tools, and slowly, illusions lose their protective nature. They become reflexive, tangled, chaotic. Zoroark stops trusting what it creates because illusions now represent fear forced upon it instead of chosen protection. That shift might be why older Zoroark becomes so fiercely territorial. When reality itself has been manipulated against you, the urge to control space becomes instinctual. Illusion becomes boundary line. Anyone crossing into protected realms doesn't simply trespass. They trespass into someone's psychological safety. And yet, trainers who earn Zoroark's trust discover a completely different side: calm, intelligent, curious, even gently playful. Under safety, illusions soften. They become tricks instead of shields. They become communication rather than defense. This shows something incredibly human. Environment shapes behavior. Some fans interpret Zoroark as symbolic, representing people who mask themselves after experiencing betrayal. They hide emotions behind elaborate illusions, not to deceive maliciously, but to survive socially. Only when someone proves trustworthy do they reveal their real self. In that sense, Zoroark's rumored history of experimentation becomes more than lore. It becomes a psychological metaphor embedded into a character design. But unlike humans, Zoroark can externalize illusions. Others actually see the walls it builds. There is also another rumor, a quieter one, suggesting that in some regions, illusion research never truly ended. Instead of capturing Zoroark outright, certain groups now monitor them at a distance, recording environmental distortions and developing technology that can detect illusion fluctuations. In other words, Humans gave up trying to control the illusion and instead started trying to pierce it. That development adds a bittersweet irony. Zoroark hides to avoid exploitation. Scientists develop tools to see through hiding. The cycle continues, curiosity chasing privacy. Yet through all of this, one truth remains constant. Illusions cannot change reality. They only shape perception. Beneath every fake battlefield lies empty grass. Zoroark's power doesn't rewrite world physics, it rewrites experience. An experience, as experiments repeatedly demonstrated, can be both beautiful and dangerous when manipulated. Late at night, imagine Zoroark standing at the edge of a cliff, wind blowing through its long mane. Below, a town sleeps peacefully. For a moment, Zoroark watches quietly. Then, sensing travelers approaching its hidden home, it lifts its claws slightly. The world shifts. Trees become walls. Rocks become shadows of unfamiliar figures. To outsiders, the path vanishes. To Zoroark's family, nothing changes at all. No fight, no noise, just safety maintained by the soft bending of perception. That might be the deepest truth hidden beneath all the theories and rumors. Zoroark never wanted to be studied, captured, or dissected. It wanted to live, unseen when necessary, peaceful when possible. Illusion isn't dominance, it is armor. And if humans once forced that armor to be drawn again and again in the name of science, the lesson left behind is simple and humbling. Sometimes mystery exists not because it refuses to be explained, but because it deserves to remain unbroken. Illusions, after all, are only frightening when we refuse to respect what they protect. Pokeballs are so common in the Pokemon world that most trainers stop questioning them. They're everywhere. They're cheap. They're handed out casually at the start of journeys, and they work almost flawlessly. You press a button, throw the ball, and somehow a living creature turns into light, vanishes inside, and then reappears later with no harm done. It's routine. But when you slow down and actually think about that process, something feels deeply mysterious. What exactly happens inside? How does a complex living organism compress into pure data, exist for hours or days in that state, and then return seamlessly to physical form? The official explanation always dances around the same idea. Pokemon are converted into digital energy inside Pokeballs. They don't die, they don't sleep. They exist as something like stored information, paused until released, that already places Pokeballs closer to advanced teleportation or quantum technology than simple containers. But once fans realized this, a new, much stranger theory appeared. What if Pokeballs don't simply store the Pokemon you caught? What if, in rare cases or under certain conditions, they actually recreate the Pokemon from data, effectively generating an artificial duplicate while the original no longer exists in normal space? The theory doesn't claim Pokeballs always do this. Instead, it suggests that when capture goes wrong, when transfer glitches occur, or when the Pokemon's biological structure can't be fully preserved, the system compensates by constructing a replica based on stored genetic and behavioral templates. In other words, the ball prioritizes continuity, making sure a version of the Pokemon still exists for the trainer, even if the original can't be restored perfectly. At first, that sounds impossible, even unethical. Yet so many tiny details across the games and lore lend unsettling support. Consider how Pokemon storage works in PC systems. A trainer can deposit dozens of living beings into virtual boxes, switching them in and out freely. These Pokemon don't appear to age while stored. They don't change unless interacted with. Time seems suspended. When withdrawn, they reappear instantly, exactly as they were. That looks less like biological dormancy and more like file retrieval, as though the Pokemon is being reconstructed based on saved data each time it materializes. Then there are the glitches, missing data, corrupted sprites, strange duplication bugs across different game generations. Within the real-world framework, these are coding issues. Within the lore, though, they suggest something more chilling. What happens when a living thing stored as data becomes mishandled or fragmented? In some rare cases, duplication appears, a perfect copy alongside the original, not cloned in the laboratory sense, but reproduced because the storage system restored two versions of the same data. The theory argues that the PC system and Pokeballs operate on the same principle. When a Pokemon is captured, its biological blueprint is scanned and encoded. When released, that blueprint is reconstructed physically, not teleported like a single object, but rebuilt in the exact pattern it had before. And most of the time, this process works flawlessly. The technology might generate something that is technically a new instance of that Pokemon, identical in memory and behavior, yet not the exact creature that was first captured. This leads to a quiet existential question. If the Pokemon has the same memories, the same personality, the same relationships, does the difference matter? To the trainer, it wouldn't. To the Pokemon, it wouldn't either, because identity, from its perspective, continues seamlessly. But philosophically, this shifts Pokeballs from being containers to something more like resurrection machines that ensure continuity above everything. Some fans connect this theory to how fainting works. A Pokemon collapses in battle, unconscious, but is quickly restored by machines at Pokemon centers. Those machines read stored biological data, recalibrate, and heal instantly. Sometimes, even extreme injuries are repaired in seconds. That level of medical capability feels less like treatment and more like reinstantiation, as if the center compares the injured body to a stored file and restores it toward its most recent, saved state. If Pokemon are treated as data while stored, then landscapes of research would naturally grow around manipulating, backing up, and recovering that data. And where there is research, there are experiments. Secret labs might have tried to replicate Pokemon from scratch using only fragments of storage data. They may have succeeded partially. Empty shells, glitch creatures, beings that look right but lack emotional stability. When these attempts failed, the prototypes would be destroyed or released, unseen, into remote regions. This idea lands us back at creatures like Ditto or unstable ghost-like anomalies, rumored to appear in old game files and fictional accounts. They feel like echoes of reconstruction gone wrong. Not naturally born, not maliciously engineered, but corrupted attempts to bring something back that no longer existed fully. Critics of the theory argue that Pokemon clearly have biological reality. They breed, evolve, age in rare canon references, and interact physically with the world. It simply claims biological Pokemon and digital reconstruction coexist as one system. A Pokemon is living tissue until captured or stored, then it becomes data. When released, it becomes tissue again, newly formed tissue matching the specification of data. The unsettling conclusion? Death becomes less absolute for captured Pokemon than for wild ones. As long as storage data is preserved, rebirth, or something extremely close to it, remains theoretically possible. From the perspective of scientists in that world, this technology could revolutionize everything: conservation, medicine, security. From the perspective of ethicists, it's terrifying. What does it mean to keep sentient life paused indefinitely, What rights exist for beings who may occasionally be replaced by perfect replicas without ever knowing? And then there is the quiet, easily overlooked detail trainers almost never see inside Pokeballs. The space is private, described vaguely as comfortable, relaxing, even personalized. That implies that Pokeballs don't simply compress a Pokemon, they create simulated environments based on the Pokemon's preferences, virtual habitats, mental comfort spaces. The Pokemon occupies a digital dreamlike state while waiting. Taken together, those facts make Pokeballs feel less like cages and more like servers hosting conscious entities inside virtual rooms. But those rooms must be maintained, updated, checked. Who is responsible when systems crash? Imagine a scenario. A Pokeball is damaged mid-transfer. Data fragments. The physical Pokemon never fully rematerializes. The system, to prevent emotional trauma to the trainer and to preserve continuity, automatically compiles the closest viable instance. The Pokemon returns, smiling as always, unaware that anything changed. Life continues, but the being now walking beside its trainer is technically version 2. Not evil, not synthetic in a sinister sense, simply recreated like restoring a file you accidentally deleted. If this were true, it would also explain why legendary Pokemon, beings often tied to mythology and cosmic forces, behave differently when captured. Their connection to reality itself may disrupt storage processes. They remain overwhelmingly unique, difficult to replicate, because their existence stretches beyond normal biological templates. That resistance suggests limits, boundaries beyond which even the most sophisticated technology cannot cross. Despite how eerie all of this sounds, the theory doesn't portray humans as villains. In most interpretations, Pokeballs were originally designed with good intentions: safe transport, painless storage, reduced suffering. Over time, their complexity grew far beyond public understanding. People trust technology they don't fully grasp because it works, because it simplifies adventure. Meanwhile, the deeper implications sink quietly beneath daily life. What makes this idea powerful isn't the horror, it's the melancholy. Trainers travel the world forming bonds with companions who might, just might, be partly sustained by an invisible network, maintaining memories and forms. Friendships remain real, emotions remain authentic. But somewhere in the background, humming like an unseen server, technology constantly ensures those stories continue without interruption. Late at night, picture a Pokeball resting on a bedside table. Inside, a Pokemon relaxes in a tranquil digital landscape shaped perfectly to its liking. Maybe a meadow, maybe a cave, maybe a peaceful pool. It feels safe, content. Its existence flows like a dream until morning comes and its trainer calls it out. The world shifts. Light assembles into shape. Reality resumes. Was it stored? Teleported? Recreated? As far as the Pokemon knows, it simply was. Before, during, and after. Perhaps that's the real heart of the theory. No matter how advanced the technology, no matter how many secrets hide in the code of Pokeballs and PC storage, life inside them still chooses, feels, laughs, and battles. If artificial reconstruction ever occurs, it doesn't erase meaning, it just complicates what we think alive truly means. And in a world where experiments constantly blur the line between natural and artificial, maybe continuity, the ability to keep existing alongside those you love, is what matters most in the end. Cinnabar Island looks peaceful at first glance. A sunny coastline, warm breezes, a quiet town tucked beside volcanic rock. Tourists come and go. Fishermen work along the docks. Trainers explore the island's gym, battling under the watchful eye of one of Kanto's most memorable leaders. Yet beneath all of that easy surface lies one of the darkest scientific legacies in the Pokemon world. A lab once filled with experiments so ambitious and morally uncertain that it eventually collapsed, both literally and figuratively, leaving behind ruins, burned documents, and half-forgotten rumors. Within those ruins, the story of cloning in the Pokemon universe begins to look far bigger than just the creation of Mewtwo. We know from scattered notes and journals that scientists on Cinnabar discovered, or were given, genetic material belonging to Mew. That discovery alone changed everything. With access to the supposed ancestor of Pokemon, they saw the opportunity of a lifetime, the chance to decode life's blueprint and rebuild it from scratch. They began isolating strands, mapping patterns, and stitching fragments together in ways that had never been attempted before. At first, their intentions may have been scientific curiosity mixed with groundbreaking optimism. Imagine what could be learned from a creature whose DNA contained echoes of every other species. Imagine the cures, enhancements, and evolutionary insights. But as results began to emerge, ambition grew heavier and ethics grew lighter. The question shifted from what can we understand to what can we control. Mewtwo was the final product of years of trial and error, but trial and error implies failures. Those failures didn't disappear. The theory suggests that before Mewtwo ever opened its eyes, the Cinnabar lab produced numerous other organisms. Some were incomplete, missing entire sections of stable DNA. Some survived only briefly, dissolving into unstable biological matter. Others may have looked functional on the outside yet lacked cognitive awareness, existing only as moving shells. In that environment, life and failure blurred together in ways that would be deeply disturbing to witness. And that's where the rumor deepens. Many of those prototypes weren't destroyed immediately. Some escaped during containment breaches. Others were quietly released into the nearby wild, where the island's ecosystem absorbed them. These creatures may have blended in or mutated into forms no one recognized. The world moved on while remnants of experiments lived quietly in shadows and caves. Supporting this idea are the strange Pokemon behaviors and appearances found around Cinnabar Island and neighboring routes, unusual populations, unpredictable mutations, Pokemon that behave slightly differently than elsewhere. They are never officially labeled as clones, but the implication remains. The landscape still carries fingerprints of scientific tampering. Inside the ruined lab itself, scattered logs reference project readings unstable, and subject viability fluctuates. Those vague phrases hide emotional gravity. They hint at researchers struggling not only with technical limitations, but with moral weight. There must have been late nights filled with debate, moments when some scientists wanted to shut everything down and others pushed forward, convinced that the breakthrough still waited one step ahead. Then came the inevitable collapse. Metaphorical first, literal later. Mewtwo's awakening destroyed any illusion of control. The same creature born from exhaustive genetic manipulation realized that its purpose had been reduced to a weapon or test subject, and in furious clarity it tore through the lab, reducing years of research into fragments. Fire spread, equipment shattered, lives changed, or ended, in seconds. The lab's charred shell now stands as monument not just to destruction, but to arrogance. Yet even after the disaster, the mystery lingers. If cloning experiments existed there, why are records so incomplete? Why are many entries deliberately obscured, as though someone didn't want the world to see exactly how far the process went? The lack of clarity almost suggests a cover-up, either by surviving researchers or governing bodies desperate to preserve trust in science. Theoretical survivors could have carried knowledge elsewhere, continuing the research in secret. After all, once humanity glimpses the possibility of controlling life itself, it rarely lets go completely. Technology may have moved underground, relocated to more hidden regions, redesigned in less blatant ways. Echoes of Cinnabar's research might still ripple quietly through later generations of scientific work, modified Pokémon, enhanced hybrids, or projects labeled with sanitized terminology to avoid panic. But there is also another perspective, more emotional, more grounded. Maybe some researchers genuinely regretted what happened. Maybe, faced with consequences, they walked away and sealed the ruins intentionally, hoping that nature would dissolve their mistakes over time. The lab's silence then becomes an act of penance rather than conspiracy. Either interpretation leaves the ruins charged with meaning. Walking through them in the games always feels eerie. The building creaks, text logs speak in clipped phrases instead of full explanations. Wild Pokémon roam halls once filled with sterile equipment. That contrast, raw life reclaiming a place built to manipulate life, tells a quiet story without using words. Nature doesn't erase human mistakes quickly. It surrounds them instead, growing vines over shattered structures, reminding anyone who visits that time keeps moving, but memory remains. Consider how locals talk about the lab today. Some treat it as a curious tourist stop, a place to explore. Others avoid it outright, referring to strange experiments and things that shouldn't have been done. That mix of intrigue and reluctance mirrors how cultures handle past tragedies in real life. The world acknowledges what happened, but often resists confronting its full truth. Mewtwo, of course, escaped and carved its own path, carrying the emotional consequences of Cinnabar more than any living scientist. But the theory that other clones still exist, changed, scattered, unidentified, adds haunting depth. Somewhere out at sea, deep in caves, or even walking quietly among ordinary Pokémon populations, there may be beings whose lineage traces not to natural evolution, but to laboratory ambition. They aren't villains. They aren't monsters. They're survivors, just like Mewtwo, caught between existence and experimentation. Imagine a lone clone, a creature never fully documented, living on the edge of the island near cliffs. It hunts, eats, sleeps, and fears like any other Pokémon. But in its cells, unstable coding occasionally flickers like a glitch in biological reality. It feels restlessness without understanding why. The sea roars, the wind blows, and it carries within itself an unsolved question. Where did I come from? That quiet existential weight is what makes the Cinnabar experiments so haunting. Unlike simple legends or mythical entities, these stories involve human hands directly shaping living beings. Success was measured in control and modification, not well-being. And when everything collapsed, the world wasn't left with myths, it was left with guilt. Yet, as with so many Pokémon narratives, hope still threads through the darkness. Trainers now walking among those same Pokémon treat them with care. Bonds form where once there was only observation. Science learns humility, or at least begins to. The ruins remain as reminders, guiding new generations toward more ethical curiosity. Cinnabar Island could have become a warning no one listened to. Instead, it became a conversation, a constant whisper carried by waves crashing against black volcanic stone. Understanding life is noble, but reshaping it carelessly is dangerous. Late at night, if you stand in imagination inside those ruined halls, you might picture flickers of what once occurred there, screens glowing, researchers debating, doors sliding open, machinery humming. Now, All that remains is silence, replaced by wild Pokemon rustling through broken tiles. Nature returned, not as a conqueror, but as a healer. And somewhere out there, scattered across the world, beings that were never meant to exist continued onward, not as experiments, but as living lives, finding meaning beyond the intentions that created them. Cinnabar's tragedy, ultimately, isn't the act of cloning itself. It's the fact that the experiment forgot the heart inside what it created, and the world has been quietly remembering ever since.